It's just wonderful to be a resource in your toolbox and to have this opportunity of being able to talk on a subject that is very near and dear to my heart, because I think any leader bumps up against the factors that we are going to be talking about in this session, and it erodes their capacity to lead at a high level of well-being. So I'm glad to be able to talk with you and your awesome listeners about this subject, and thanks for spearheading it.
Welcome to the Global Fringe podcast, hosted by April Diaz. This is a show featuring leading voices from the fringe, mostly women and people of color, who are on the journey to live and lead with wholeness. This season will guide you on your own journey towards wholeness in body, mind, and spirit in full partnership with men. It's time.
Hey friends, welcome back. This season, we have been focusing on two really important areas of life and leadership, and that is how can we be whole in our body, mind, and spirit, and how can we live and lead in partnership between men and women. And this season has been fantastic. The voices, the leaders from the fringe have contributed so much to how do we actually do this, real practically speaking, but also on that, bigger level of vision of what does it look like for us to do this. And today we are close to the end of this season, and my neighbor / friend / pastor, licensed clinical psychologist, Dr. Wes Beavis, is with us today. And I met Wes at least a decade ago, I think. I don't even remember the year, but I remember the place. We were in a friend's living room and we were talking about church and mission, and you had this fantastic accent that I was drawn to and wondering, where's this dude and his amazing wife, Ellie, from? And then 2 years ago, we wound up being neighbors. And so he's literally around the corner from my house. But besides that really important part of who you are, Dr. Beavis, you specialize in mental health and the well-being of leaders, which is why I want you to be here with us today, because the mental health, the burnout factor for leaders is maybe getting more attention than a lot of things these days. And so I'm so grateful for you being on the show with us today. You've written this new book called Let's Talk About Ministry Burnout. And it's not just a bunch of random ideas or, research that's been taken from the confines of your practice, but it's a research-based approach to the well-being of pastors specifically, but I think leaders in general. And if I can wrap myself out, I was part of the research of this book. We sat at a coffee shop together and you asked amazing questions that have led into the book. So there's a lot to say just in the introduction about who you are, but thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much for this book.
April, I am delighted to be a part of your world. It's just wonderful to be a resource in your toolbox and to have this opportunity of being able to talk on a subject that is very near and dear to my heart, because I think any leader bumps up against the factors that we are going to be talking about in this session, and it erodes their capacity to lead at a high level of well-being. So I'm glad to be able to talk with you and your awesome listeners about this subject, and thanks for spearheading it.
Absolutely. Okay, so first tell us, where is your fantastic accent from?
Well, I come from down south.
Not Texas, not Mexico.
No, more south than that. I come from a land down under, Australia.
But you've been in the States for over 15 years, right?
Oh yeah, very much so. I have now, think I've passed the point of having lived in Australia and America equal time frames.
Wow, that's amazing. You also said that this is your 9th book, but that this book you have probably spent more energy, effort, attention than the previous 8 combined, because this is such an important issue. So we're gonna frame this whole conversation around mental health and caring for your inner world, so that you don't burn out as a spiritual leader, so that you can live and lead with wholeness. That's possible. Like, that's not just a pie in the sky dream that can never happen. It's possible for us to live with that kind of wholeness. And this season, we've talked a lot about transitions, managing tensions of a full life, around, butting up against cultural expectations in life and leadership. And so this is a big conversation. But if we could just start by you telling us, like, what actually is burnout? Where does it begin?
Burnout is a debilitating condition that undermines a person's energy, their optimism, and their work effectiveness. It's not a sudden event. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not like coming down with a cold where you go, got a scratchy throat. I think I'm coming down with the rhinovirus. It happens over an extended period of time. It's the compounding effect of a multitude of what I call micro losses. And, we think when we are faced with situations that grate on our spirit, we like to think that we can shake it off. But often, rather than shake it off, we just absorb it, and we absorb it in. One of the things about being in ministry and leadership is that there are good things that happen in those areas of vocation and profession. But there are also some really tough things that happen. And sometimes we think that the highs would cancel out the lows, that if we have enough highs, then we don't, that it seems to compensate for the lows. But the reality is, and I know this as a clinical psychologist, the highs and the lows, take an emotional toll on the persons. So all of those things, it's not sudden, it doesn't happen overnight. It's often the compounding effect of micro losses, and just acknowledging the fact that the bandwidth of leadership, the highs and the lows, need to be dealt with.
Yeah. Why do you think it is particularly that spiritual leaders are particularly susceptible to burnout? Is it just the amount of the highs and lows? Is it the amount of people that we're working with? Is it I don't know, the expectations of external environment? Like, I know there's not a magic bullet on that, but you've worked with hundreds of leaders and you've done extensive research on this. So what is it that makes leaders more susceptible to burnout to begin with?
Oh, that is a huge question. A great question.
Can we solve it today?
Of course, if you're talking to an expert on the subject. Where does burnout begin? Well, where do I start? There are multiple factors that can start us on the burnout trajectory. It can be a low vocational satisfaction. All work is hard. Not all the time, but, work is hard. But there's a type of work that can really drain the life out of your spirit. And sometimes it's a vocational situation that can put you on the course towards burnout. Other times it can be working for a tyrannical boss or a leader who just continually undermines your confidence. Another aspect that makes leaders at this level susceptible is that sometimes we can be working in situations where we are responsible for positive outcomes, but we don't have control over the elements needed to create those desirable outcomes. And then there's the pressure to prove yourself. As much as we don't like to admit, we do live in a culture which values and judges certain success metrics. There can be a despair over the lack of results, of the lack of positive results. Of course, there's always a result. Sometimes it's negative, but sometimes it's just the lack of positive results. Inadequate boundaries and self-care. I mean, there's just so many. I outline them in my book, and I've just referenced just a few of them. But April, if you were to force me to choose two factors.
Oh, I do. I want to force you.
Okay, you're forcing me. Okay, then I would bring it down to this. The two factors that start the burnout process is number one, thinking that burnout is what happens to other people.
Mm. So
And the
you're
second,
exempt from it. Like you think
yeah,
it happens to other people, but it can never happen to me.
somehow you're able to leap buildings in a single bound, and so you just have that sense of specialness about you, which could be, that there's some narcissistic elements in that, which all leaders have. I think, in reality, every person is narcissistic to some extent. It's just we get to a point where that becomes problematic and starts interrupting me. So the first thing is thinking that burnout is something that happens to other people and that somehow we are inoculated from it because we're so special. And then the second thing is that we ignore the signs. I don't know about you, what type of vehicle you drive.
A minivan.
April.
It's amazing.
Well,
Swagger wagon.
Do you have on your dashboard a light that comes on where it says check engine? Yeah. Well, there are certain signals in our own psychology, our own makeup, which are check engine lights for us. And I think leaders have a great capacity to take out a little card of positive sayings and stick it over the check engine light, or even a Bible verse, stick it over the check engine light. And we tend to override the warning signals. Now you may ask, what would be a warning signal for a leader? Well, one of them is when you have a short fuse, when in situations which you could normally handle with grace and style, that all of a sudden you're snapping and you're, really tearing into people in a way that's uncharacteristic of how you normally be. Well, that's an indication that your resiliency factors have been negatively impacted, and you're now, you're dealing with anger issues, short fuse. So that's a check engine light. When you find yourself getting short with people, it's like, whoa! Don't tape a Bible verse over that.
Yeah, totally.
Listen to what that's saying.
Yeah. You do an incredible job in the book of both being like relational and pastoral and comforting, while being very practical and outlining this is what it looks like and this is what you can do. And, you're not the special snowflake. You are just like every other human that has the capacity for this to happen. So I'm wondering if you can give us just a quick overview of the 6 different stages of burnout. And I will say, as I read it, like I could see myself in different aspects, in different seasons of time in this progression. But I found it very interesting how you talked about there being an increased acceleration in the 3rd through the 6th stages. So quickly give us an overview of those 6, but then what is it about those latter stages that makes it like a snowball effect for us?
April, let me just give you some background at how I came up with these 6 stages. When I went into my doctoral program, I started studying what it was to be burned out, studied all the literature. Part of when a person is in the process of becoming a doctor, you've got to add something new to the worldwide body of knowledge. And so this couldn't be just, this was my idea or this is my experience. It really is based on research. So I interviewed a whole host of leaders. And this is what my research revealed, that there was a sequence of stages that you go through to what I call being clinically burned out. So you've asked for a quick snapshot, and I'll give you a quick snapshot. For a full picture, I really encourage your listeners
to
read
the
my book.
Yeah, seriously. The snapshot is only going to whet your appetite and give you enough to make you intrigued, but it's it's not enough. We got to get started here.
So stage one is when you're emotionally exhausted. It's just when you get to that point where you think, I am so drained, I can't think straight. And I was reminded of this just last night in one of my clinical sessions. I had a leader come to see me in my private practice. And at the end, when it came to, he was writing out a check, and he meant to give the check to me, but gave the pen to me and then put the check back in his little folder. Then he realized his mistake, and then he gave me the check, but then he realized he hadn't filled it in. And all of this, he was going, what's wrong with me? I can't even write a check out. And that's because the session that he had been in, that we'd just been involved in, was so emotionally taxing that he just couldn't couldn't function in a state that you would normally be able to function quite well. And that's what happens when you're emotionally exhausted. It's just like, I can't even think straight. So that leads into stage two, which is your negative thinking starts to happen more frequently and hangs around longer. And then you move into stage three, where you find your mood being influenced by things like depression and anxiety and other factors, anger, and then that leads into stage four, which is you just don't want to be around people. And you actually take great steps just to avoid interacting with other people, which is a problem because people, to be healthy, to be in a state of wellness really requires us to be interacting with other people. And then you move into stage five, which is you're not motivated to work. And that's a problem if somebody's out there paying you to produce. And then you go into a really debilitating stage six, where you're questioning your value and your identity. You're making statements like, I'm a failure. Who am I? Do I bring anything good to the world?
Yeah. So why is there that increased acceleration once you hit stage three?
Yeah, great point. I mean, if you could think about, we're driving a car down a road. And if we're driving down the burnout road, as we proceed further down the burnout road, the less our steering works, the less our brakes work, the less control we have over our speed. And all those things compounding on each other, we're going to end up in a ditch much quicker towards the back end. You lose those things. So relating it back to the stages of burnout, when you don't have any emotional fuel in your tank, when you're lacking a positive view of things, if your capacity to bounce back from difficult situations is gone, and if you've isolated yourself from social support, then your speed towards clinical burnout is just going to increase, because all of those strengths, all of those resiliency factors, you no longer have access to them. And so it's just natural that towards stages 4, 5, and 6, you can drop off very quickly.
Yeah, you start running on fumes, right? Like you get to the end of the gas tank and you can only go so far, but then those fumes are just going to burn real quick.
You've got it.
Yeah, oh my gosh. I feel like I see this so much, and there's a lot that's happening on a cultural level to raise some awareness. And certainly the work that you're doing is really critical, because we need leaders to be whole. We need for leaders to care for their body, mind, and spirit so that they can make the kind of impact that it is going to be productive, that's going to be leading others towards life. And yet, like, that's not all of our experiences all the time.
And April, my quest is to help leaders recognize the signs early up, because well, let me explain it this way. Let me use a medical model. If somebody, if we were to walk into a crowded room, there's maybe a small portion of people that have stage 1 cancer, but we would never know it because they look normal. But if we were in a crowded room and somebody came in and they were in stage 4 cancer, then it would be obvious. Even you and I, without medical degrees, we could say something is not well with that person. But here's the kicker. Stage 4 cancer is easier to diagnose, but much harder to treat. Whereas if we were to catch stage 1, it's much easier to treat. But in stage 1 is harder to diagnose because people look normal. So the same thing works for burnout. It's like, we could look at somebody and just say, oh, they're having a hard day, or, they're just tired, or they're just fatigued. Well, that might be true, but they could also be in a stage of the preliminary stages of burnout. So my quest is to try and catch leaders when they're in stage 1, stage 2, because it's much easier to treat at that point.
Yeah, which also requires us as leaders to have an increasing self-leadership, which I am crazy passionate about. And it's in a lot of the coaching that I do, because if leaders can lead themselves, they can lead themselves to their whole self, and they can avoid some of this stuff, not because they are what was the word? Inoculated to it, but because they are mindful and present and aware of what is happening within them. I was telling you before we hit the record button, I was on a coaching call this morning with a leader, and she actually went through burnout about 19 or 20 years ago. And a lot of things in her life just fell apart and erupted as a result of it. But she recovered. She got back into leadership. She is pastoring in a local church. And she is noticing she's really kind of at that stage 1 or 2 right now. And there's some mental health stuff that she's paying attention to that's off kilter. And so she's taking some time away in the next couple of months to recover, recalibrate, pay attention to her body, bring some wholeness in her emotional well-being. And I think, like she said, I don't know that I would have done that 20 years ago. Like, I didn't have the warning signs. I didn't know what were going to be the accelerators to the burnout, but I see that now. And so she's taking proactive steps, which is amazing. But sometimes you walk through some of that and then you learn it. But how can we be proactive in noticing what those burnout accelerators are? You said you're so passionate about that. And so help us figure out, how do we be proactive to not slip into this?
For starters, just look at what the warning signals, the check engine lights, the add fuel lights on the dashboard of our life are saying. I love the fact that you're a coach and you are integrally involved in helping people navigate this journey. And April, I just know you're a brilliant coach and you have a reputation for that. And I really encourage all your listeners, if you don't have a coach, certainly take advantage of the skills that April had. Hire her, because she can. Okay, let me explain it this way. My son, when he was going through university, played rugby. And one day I got a phone call that said, "Dad, I'm on the way to the emergency room. I've broken my arm." And so my wife and I, we go to the emergency room, and in comes the orthopedic surgeon, and he shows us the x-ray, and sure enough, his forearm is just snapped in two. And then he turns to us and he says, "Okay, here are the options. Number one, we can just leave it alone. And, the bones will eventually kind of find each other and they will fuse together and they will heal. But the problem is that's going to be more painful. It's going to take longer, and the bones could heal in a problematic way, which causes problems down the line." And then he said, we could try to apply traction. We could try to get the bones aligned as close as possible, and then put some plaster on. He says that's certainly better than the first option, but it's still going to take 6 to 8 weeks. And then I turned to him and said, "Well, what would you do if this was your son?" And he said, "I would go in there, I would open him up, I would get a titanium plate, I would put the bones together exactly in the place that they need to be. And I would put some screws in there. He said, even though it's requires some invasive treatment, he says it's going to be less painful, it's going to heal quicker, and he's going to have the least amount of potential for problems down the line. So this is how I see you, April, is that you come in and you help people heal quicker with less pain and heal in such a way, or orient themselves and their leadership in such a way that they're not going to be tripping over continual burnout symptomology down the line. So while there can be many things that cause burnout, and they can be different from every person, what is most important is how you treat the symptoms. Now, you can bumble along by yourself, and potentially you can recover from burnout by yourself, but the chances of it being long and protracted, I mean, sometimes people recover from burnout over 6 or 7 years, where if they got together with somebody like yourself or myself, we can help them be able to get alignment in the various pieces of their lives in such a way that that alignment can be stronger, they can be more aware, and therefore the prospects of them tripping over the burnout issues in the future are less. So yes, hiring you requires an investment, but my goodness, if you can help people get back to health and wholeness in a matter of months as opposed to a matter of years, and sometimes people don't heal enough to even get back into the game, then it's just a worthwhile investment. So I really encourage your listeners out there to take advantage of the great skills you have in this area.
Well, in the same way, I tell leaders all the time, I think every leader needs a therapist, needs a spiritual director, and needs a coach. And not to use them all at the same time, but to be aware in different seasons or chapters where you need to make a phone call and say, I need to create a contract with you. I need to visit your office. I need to make some appointments with you, because you need someone who is going to walk with you in your past, your present, and your future. And people who are trained in each of those disciplines allow you to do that. And so if a leader wants to be well, wants to be whole, and wants to be the fullness of who they've just been created to be, like, you've got to have folks that you pay money to and folks that matter, who have been trained in this, that are going to help you to do that. So it's an investment, but gosh, we spend money on all kinds of things all the time that don't contribute to our wholeness. And so, a topic like this, a conversation around being proactive and preventative in burnout, is a worthwhile investment, because we're talking about your whole life and all of the people that are around you that matter, and the work that you are doing that is supposed to have impact on the world. So you are worth it. You are worth the investment. And we need to pay attention.
April, if I can jump in here and really advise your listeners to jump in on the front end as soon as they see the signals, because what the insidious thing about burnout is that the more we go into stage 4, 5, and 6, the more our thinking processes are corrupted. And once I told the executives that I work with who are struggling with this, once you're in stage 4, 5, and 6, you cannot trust your decision making, because you're making critical decisions when part of the code in your operating system has been corrupted or is glitchy. So if anybody out there is experiencing, you think, wow, I think I'm experiencing kind of stage 1, stage 2, get to it then when your thinking is more premium than on the back end when, gee, you can't even trust your thinking because it's not going to make premium decisions.
Yeah. So one of the things that I appreciated about your book is that you were really proactive to make sure that you talked with women who are in spiritual leadership, which is why our conversation happened as well. And I'm wondering if there's unique challenges for women in spiritual leadership when it comes to burnout and their mental health.
April, I came at the incorporating more women into my research as I was. Um, I thought I'd finished my book, and then I put it out to my editor and somebody that I really trusted, and he came back and said, "Listen, women are really underrepresented in your sample size," and he was right. And so I didn't like hearing that because it added probably another 6 months, maybe 9 months to the writing process because I had to go back out into the field. And I was so glad that I did because I learned that a woman's experience in church and spiritual leadership has got some uniqueness that the guys didn't share in their experience. And part of it is, unfortunately, ministry at the higher, especially at the higher levels of leadership, is still predominantly male. And one of the things that unfortunately female pastors feel the burden of is having to prove themselves more than their male counterparts. And the reality is, you can have a female pastor and a male pastor at the kind of the same level, start at the same time, and yet the male will get a few more privileges than the female. And so the female will feel that she has to work harder in order to prove herself. And when we are being propelled by this sense that we need to prove ourselves, that's one of the burnout accelerators.
Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful. I agree. I mean, I think that was my experience as well. And, there was a research bit that came out of Harvard years and years ago that talked about women and people of color that are on the margins feel the freight of being iconic. That if you are the only female at the table, or if you're the only person of color on the team, there is this weight that you carry that you're representing your whole gender or your whole ethnic community or your whole uniqueness that you bring to the table. And so it's not just about your job anymore. It's representative of a whole lot of other things. And that proving can be exhausting and create so much tension that needs to be externalized. Otherwise, it starts manifesting into the things that we've talked about. So let's turn here for a second. And I would love to hear from you of what are some essential things that leaders can do to integrate their body, mind, and spirit that would move them towards wholeness and move them away from burnout.
Recognize that you are human. And you and me, like everybody else out there, has a breaking point. And unfortunately, I find in clinical practice that it's not until a person is completely broken that they'll come in and they'll put their hand up and say, "Hey, I need some help here." A classic case is couples that come in for marriage counseling. Oh my goodness. So many couples come in when their marital house is almost burned to the ground. And, I'm thinking, this is like waiting until your house is almost burnt to the ground before calling the fire department. It's like maybe when the fire broke out in your kitchen would have been a better time.
Things that we never would do in the physical world and our physical stuff. Like we don't apply the same wisdom or discernment to our emotions or our spirit or our bodies even. It's crazy.
Exactly right. I would say listen to the aches and the pains. They're trying to tell you something. And that's why I have maybe a different approach to depression than perhaps other clinicians or the culture. We live in a culture that certainly sees depression as the enemy. We need to get rid of depression. And I don't take that position. I think depression plays a constructive role in our lives. It's an indicator. It's a check engine light on our dashboard that says something's not working right here. So let's just pull over to the side and let's lift the hood and let's see what's going on in here. Because depression is not the enemy, it's the lack of constructive treatment for depression and anxiety and the lack of wholeness. So, the reality is we're always, trying to achieve wholeness, and the lack of wholeness is not the problem. It's the lack of recognition and the lack of constructive responses, the lack of constructive treatment for that lack of wholeness. April, even though I am in my 50s and towards the back end of my 50s, I run marathons.
I know you do. You just finished one a couple of weeks ago. Well,
I
done.
did. I was a year older, and I managed to shave 15 minutes off my personal record, which I don't know how I did that, but it must have been a very good day. But that, when I finished the marathon the next day, my muscles are telling me things. My muscles are saying I'm inflamed, and I need some gentleness. My bones, my joints are saying, hey, I am thinking that not going out for a run tomorrow or the next day is a really good thing. Give me a chance, give me some time to heal. So I would say that to people in integrating body, mind, and spirit in our quest to move towards wholeness is to listen to what the check engine lights are saying. Depression, anxiety, loneliness, and the lack of resiliency, the anger factors, all of those are signals that are trying to convey to us that we need to stop what we're doing and maybe take a different approach and maybe just rest. The classic, put the oxygen mask on ourselves. Because when we become oxygen starved, and that's the experience of depression and anxiety and burnout is really a state of being oxygen starved in our spirit. And the problem with being oxygen starved is we start to lose the capacity to recognize important objects, important factors in our lives. That's why they say, put the parents who are traveling with children, put the oxygen mask on yourself first, because if you're oxygen starved, you're not even going to be able to recognize that your children are important to you in that moment. So listen to what those things are saying, and don't shame yourself. If you're a little depressed, don't shame yourself. Don't try and guilt yourself or shame yourself out of them. It's part of what you said before so brilliantly, self-leadership.
Mm-hmm. Right. And being human. I think that part of the shift that I hope that's happening in some of the mental health crisis that we're in is that we normalize leaders as humans, that they are not, I mean, we're superheroes in a way, but we're not flying in the sky and we're not breaking through gravity barriers. Like we're human. And as a result, like we get to take care of ourselves. We get to pay attention. We get to honor what is happening in our body, mind, and spirit. And I think that creates a different kind of superpower because it allows us to connect with the people that we are leading. And that becomes such a gift. We're not above or beyond or separate from our people. Like we are with them. And in our quest of wholeness in our humanity, I think we get to lead the way in that too. So I'm really grateful for your work. I'm really grateful for this book. It is timely. It is important. So we will link in the show notes, obviously, to how people can get their hands on the book. There is a really helpful ministry leader burnout assessment. So if you're listening to this conversation and you've got some warning flags going off, or you have a coworker or a friend that you think needs to listen to this episode or take that assessment, It's really helpful in the book, and I'd strongly recommend that you take that as just an initial next step. But do you have any other next steps, Dr. Beavis?
Well, April, not only do I have that quick one-page assessment in the book, but I've gone on to have an app on my website. So if you go to drwesbeavis.com, it's a quick 6-question questionnaire that you can either take on a computer or your cell phone, and then it will assess your responses and give you an immediate diagnosis of what stage you may be in and protective measures and responsive measures that you can take. So
awesome. Thank you for that. Okay, we'll link that to the show notes. Is there any other place that people can find you and connect up in the work that you're doing?
Absolutely. Just through my website, drwesbeavis.com. And that's a great way to connect with me. I still do private practice for people who are in leadership, and I help people navigate their way back to health and wholeness. So I'm here to serve.
And I mean, you're training leaders and organizations all over the country. You're traveling a ton these days. So there's that as an option too, I think, for people that would love to bring you in to do some training and some leadership work for them. So
absolutely. When you think of it, April, we have these leaders that spend so much time at university level, graduate level studies, so much financial investment, and then they get out there and burn out. And it's like, it's a terrible return on investment. So I spend in my clinical practice time kind of downstream as they've gone over the waterfall, but through the rapids, and by the time they get to me in my clinical setting, they're so bashed up and bruised they're wondering whether they can still breathe. So I also spend a lot of time going back upstream and saying, hey, this is what's ahead if you're not on the lookout. There's some waterfalls, there's some rapids there. And so I'm wanting to get to leaders before they actually go over the falls. Preventative. It just seems to be a much better return on investment.
Yeah, it's just smarter. Let's be preventative so that we don't have to do so much back work. Well, thank you so much. I know, or I've told you, I'm asking 3 questions for every single guest that kind of align with this whole season that we have been in. So 60 seconds or less, just real quick gut responses to these 3 questions. You ready?
Go.
Okay. What does it look like for women to be warriors?
To me, a woman is a warrior who acknowledges the injustices in her world, but she chooses to be brilliant anyway.
Oh my gosh. I love that. That's beautiful. Amazing. Okay, second one. What is the number one practice that leads you towards wholeness?
Okay. Well, it's kind of changed for me over the years. With my faith, I journal, and I still do. I started that decades ago. I journal every day. There was a season where physical exercise, I gained some weight. It was depressing me, so I started running. It really helped. So that physical exercise piece helped me. But the one that is currently the most potent is sitting down with a therapist. I know, yes, I am a doctor of clinical psychology, but I'm a human first. And I think sitting down with my therapist and just working through the issues, working through things that I wouldn't talk to anyone in the world about, but just having that safe space and that trained person has done a world of good in helping me put together some of the broken pieces that I've had to deal with and that everybody has to deal with.
Yep, that's awesome. All right, last one. If you could wave a magic wand and make some things happen just by waving the wand in the area, how would you speak courage into men to partner better with women?
For every man out there, there is a woman that suffered to bring him into the world, without exception. No man would be alive without a woman. That is the first partnership a male experiences with a woman. And I think life lived at its best is to relate to females in the spirit of that life-giving original partnership.
Wow. Well, I love watching how you partner with your wife as well. And she's equally as brilliant and wonderful. And I'm so grateful for the work that you guys do individually and the way that you're doing it together as a couple. And so thank you so much for spending some time with us today. Again, I think this topic is incredibly important. If we don't talk about burnout or mental health, we are missing out on a giant area of wholeness. And so, yeah, thank you for the work that you've done and continue to do. And we are cheering you on over here and hope that other folks will get this book in their hands, buy it in bulk, give it to the folks in your world that are leading, because it will make a difference in how you do that well.
April, I just want to say a word to all your listeners. You are so valuable, too valuable to be a burnout statistic. We need you. We need every one of you to be experiencing wholeness and well-being. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this podcast. Thank you, April, for the investment you're making in all of your listeners. And I just want to encourage your listeners, if you are feeling a little burned out, catch it before it becomes something that gets way out of control. Because we need you. You are so valuable. So, April, thank you for what you're doing. You're a hero of mine, and I appreciate you and all your listeners.
Thank you, friends.
Thank you for joining the Global Fringe. Help us spread the word by rating and reviewing and sharing with your people. If you're excited about this season, become a Patreon on Patreon for as little as $5 a month. Finally, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a thing. Hey friends, do you love podcasts like the one you just listened to? Have you ever dreamed about having your own? Well, my name is Michael and I work for Truthwork Media. We believe that everyone has a story and every story deserves a podcast. Let us help you get started. Look us up at www.truthworkmedia.com, fill out our questionnaire, and I'll schedule a time to talk. It's really that easy. Truthwork Media. Everyone has a story. Yours needs a podcast.